Welcome back. We're at CogX Hybrid Festival 2021, and welcome to this research stage. I'm Christine Foster. I'm CCO at the Alan Turing Institute, and we're the UK's Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence, based just nearby in the British Library. And throughout this entire festival, we're going to be addressing the question, how do we get the next 10 years right? There are CEOs, entrepreneurs, academics, artists, activists, policymakers, all working to realize the biggest transformation opportunities of our time and address the challenges along the way. And most of CogX is free, so do invite your network. This next session is curated with the Alan Turing Institute, and it marks the launch of a new report, which examines the benefits and challenges raised by the use of AI in financial services. We're going to hear about the report's main findings and highlight the relevance for financial service providers, regulators, consumers, and other stakeholders. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Cosmina Dorobantu from both the Alan Turing Institute and the Oxford Internet Institute. Cosmina.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christine. And welcome everyone to the session on AI in financial services. We're very excited to have you join us for the launch of a new Turing report. The report was commissioned by the Financial Conduct Authority and considers a number of topics, including AI challenges, benefits, and transparency. We hope that the report will be of use to all firms using or contemplating AI and machine learning and will support the FCA's future work on digital markets. Before I share with you today's agenda, a quick introduction to who we are. My name is Cosmina Dorobantu. I'm the Deputy Director of the Alan Turing Institute's Public Policy Research Program. And I'm delighted to be joined today by two colleagues, Ravi Bhalla from the Financial Conduct Authority. Over to you, Ravi.
Hi, yes, my name's Ravi Bhalla, Head of Department for Innovate in the FCA. This entails leading a department which fosters and stimulates desirable innovation safely. It has four functions. The first is our regulatory sandbox. The second, our direct support and advice unit services. Third, our engagement with our domestic, regional and international ecosystem through bilateral and multilateral agreements. And finally, the last area is AI thought leadership.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Ravi. We're also joined today by Florian Ostmann from the Alan Turing Institute's Public Policy Program. Over to you, Florian.
Thank you, Cosmina. I'll keep it very brief. My name is Florian Ostmann. I'm the policy theme lead within the Public Policy Program at the Alan Turing Institute. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us from my side as well. And I will be back later on to provide a summary of our report.
Great. We're ready to kick off. So in terms of the agenda today, Ravi will start by giving us an overview of artificial intelligence and how the FCA views its application in financial services. I'll then give a quick introduction to the Alan Turing Institute and why we're very excited to have been commissioned by the FCA to look at AI in finance. And Florian will provide an overview of the report itself. We won't have Q&A as part of our session today, but we welcome any feedback on the report at the email address policy@turing.ac.uk. And with that, Ravi, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Cosmina. It is a pleasure to be here today with the Alan Turing Institute to talk about artificial intelligence and how we, as the regulator, view its application in financial services. Finance plays a fundamental role at the heart of daily life for almost every single person. In a joint survey with the Bank of England on the use of machine learning in financial markets in the UK, published in October 2019, we noted that AI applications in financial markets are likely to more than double in the next 3 years. The joint survey with the Bank of England was a milestone for us, not just in terms of better understanding technological changes in markets, but also what such changes may mean for the way financial markets are regulated, in particular AI. COVID-19 has accelerated this trend. The Bank of England recently surveyed banks, half of which reported an increase in the importance of AI as a result of the pandemic. AI is an area that can deliver real value for consumers and the economy by providing greater access or more tailored services. It can make credit more widely available, including to underserved communities through improved calculations of the individual risk of default. It can, where appropriate, help identify and support vulnerable consumers. It creates operational efficiencies in the way financial markets and firms operate through enhanced consumer engagement tools such as chatbots. It can also drive down costs for certain products, lowering the barrier for entry for services like robo-advice, and it can facilitate competitive market entry by startup firms that offer new capabilities that challenge incumbent technology providers. The FCA doesn't have one universal approach to harm across financial services, because harm takes different forms in different markets and therefore has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. And this is the same with AI. If firms are deploying AI and machine learning, they need to ensure they have a solid understanding of the technology and the governance around it. AI and its application in financial services is causing us to ask big questions. We can't arrive at these answers on our own, given the broad implications. But as the regulator of one of the world's biggest financial centres, we believe we have a key role to play. This supports the FCA's business priority, fair value in the digital age. Understanding technological change and the way it changes markets and outcomes for consumers is a core aspect of the work in this area. And we are doing this in two ways. The first is the AI Public-Private Forum. We consider that now is a pivotal moment for the UK to consider how best to support firms' safe adoption of AI and what this means for the relevant regulatory frameworks. To inform our decision about regulatory frameworks, we've been engaging with fintech firms, other financial services firms and authorities, in particular through the AI Public-Private Forum. This year-long initiative, co-chaired with the FCA and Bank of England, brings together a diverse group of experts to discuss the key issues related to data, model risk management and governance. This includes examining how existing policy frameworks affect and encompass AI and what the appropriate level of any future potential policy should be. The minutes from each of the quarterly AI Public-Private Forum meetings are publicly available, and the AI Public-Private Forum will produce a final report upon its conclusion later this year. The FCA and the Bank of England have done a lot of work in this space already to lay the foundations to become more data-enabled regulators and to harness the benefits that use data and data analytics. Secondly, as part of our business plan priority, fair value in the digital age, we have also collaborated with the Alan Turing Institute and commissioned this joint report on AI transparency. Transparency is a key ethical principle in the deployment of AI, contributing to good governance, firm accountability, and ultimately, we hope, the right outcome for consumers and markets. I will now hand over to my colleague Cosmina and Florian from the Alan Turing Institute to provide a summary of the key themes from the report.
Thank you so much, Ravi. We have a few slides to go through for the next bit of our session. Perfect. So a quick overview of the agenda for the rest of the session. First and foremost, a quick introduction to the Alan Turing Institute. So the Turing is the National Institute for Data Science and AI. We partner with 13 universities from all across the UK, which gives us unequaled access to expertise in these domains. We are a community of 500 plus multidisciplinary researchers working at the forefront of AI and data science innovation. In 2018, in what seems like forever ago, but it's only a little over 3 years ago, we launched a public policy program with the aims of helping policymakers take advantage of the latest generation of data-intensive technologies and building the ethical foundations for the use of data science and AI. Our job is to link the UK's government and regulators to the Institute's community of AI researchers. In the past 3 years, more than 85 public sector organizations have reached out to the program for help, including 11 regulators. And at the moment, we are the size of a large academic department. We set up and oversee 40+ research projects involving more than 80 academic researchers from 20 universities. Thus far, we've conducted hundreds of thousands of hours of work for the public sector. So why are we excited to have been commissioned by the FCA to look at AI in financial services? Well, some people might say that there's no reason to get excited, that AI is not a new field. It has a decades-long history of research and development, and it is dominating today's headlines only because the last 10 years have seen advancements in computing power, improvements in machine learning algorithms, cheaper and bigger data storage solutions, and larger investments. Others might say that there's no reason to get excited because AI is not all that it is hyped up to be. When you do a Google image search for AI in financial services, you get these futuristic looking images of typing robots. The why robots would need to type is another question, and artificial brains, which are far from today's reality. To all these people, we would say that what we find exciting about AI in the financial services is that it is a set of digital technologies that can help with some important tasks. First and foremost, prediction and forecasting. These are tasks focused on estimating the future value of a variable of interest. Examples here include predicting loan defaults, insurance costs, purchasing decisions, or stock values and portfolio returns. Secondly, optimization tasks, namely tasks which focus on estimating the optimal value of a given variable of interest. Relevant examples here include identifying optimal pricing or prudential risk management strategies. And last, but certainly not least, detection tasks, which are focused on identifying the occurrence of phenomena of interest, often through the detection of outliers or anomalies in the data. And examples here include detecting cybersecurity threats or identifying different forms of fraud, market abuse, or suspicious activities in the context of anti-money laundering. The other thing that is tremendously exciting is the increasing number of AI uses in the financial sector. AI has been powering, in the background, email spam filters and cybersecurity defense systems for a while. But we are in a world today where we're moving from the areas in blue to the ones in red, from AI being used to filter unwanted emails to it being used for loan decisions or insurance underwriting. This move opens up a world of opportunity for financial services providers, but also gives rise to new risks. AI use in spam filters is much less problematic from an ethical or regulatory perspective than AI use in loan decisions. Through the work commissioned by the Financial Conduct Authority, we were thrilled to be given the opportunity at the Alan Turing Institute to devote some time to thinking about this balance between the benefits and harms brought about by the growing use of AI in the financial services. One of the questions that we have asked ourselves is, can AI transparency help in the search for this balance? The answer is yes, it can. And my colleague Florian Ostmann will now take you through some of our logic in reaching this answer.
Thank you very much, Cosmina. So I'm now going to use the next 20 minutes or so to give a brief summary of the report's structure and its main findings. In terms of report structure, our report is divided into 4 main parts. The first part consists of an introduction to AI in the context of financial services, where we explain relevant technical concepts and discuss the relationship between them. The second part then moves on to considering general challenges and guiding principles for responsible AI adoption. The challenges that we discuss in this section aren't unique to financial services. They also apply to other domains of AI use, but they provide the foundation for understanding the causes and roots of AI-related risks in financial services. And so we decided to dedicate a whole chapter to provide that background understanding. The third part then moves on to considering the concrete potential impacts of different uses of AI in financial services, which includes considering potential benefits as well as potential harms that may occur if the general challenges previously discussed aren't addressed effectively. And the fourth part finally provides an in-depth discussion of AI transparency, considering different forms that AI transparency can take, and emphasizing and setting out the importance of transparency as a principle to guide the responsible adoption of AI. So that's the structure. I'm now going to briefly move through each of these parts and give a short summary of the high-level key takeaways in each part. Starting with the introduction to AI, here we begin by dedicating some time to discussing the research field of AI, its historical contexts, relevant methodological connections. But the main focus of the chapter really is on thinking about concrete technological changes that we see as currently underpinning the various forms of AI adoption that we see in financial services. And in particular, we consider and distinguish three elements of innovation, namely machine learning, non-traditional data, and automation. Machine learning, as most of you in the audience will be well aware, refers to a set of methods of different degrees of complexity for developing models. Those models can serve two broad purposes. First, they can be used for traditional data analytics tasks, such as, for example, predicting insurance costs or predicting stock prices. And secondly, machine learning models can be used for the processing of unstructured data. So examples here would be different uses of computer vision, image recognition, for example, or different natural language processing applications. So that's machine learning. The second element of innovation is non-traditional data, which we define quite simply as any type of data that hasn't historically been used by firms for a given business task. And there are quite a lot of examples in the current financial services landscape for such non-traditional data. In the context of credit scoring, for example, we might think of the use of financial transaction data to predict the likelihood of default. There are also a lot of examples in the financial trading context, an exotic example being the use of satellite imagery to predict commodity prices, for example. That's non-traditional data. And then finally, we have automation, which for the purposes of the report, we define as any use of technology that involves a reduction in the role of humans in making decisions or executing business tasks. Now, AI systems may rely on all three of these elements together, or they may rely on a subset of those elements. So it's not always necessarily the case that all three elements are involved. And the premise of our report is that it is important and useful to distinguish between these elements. And rather than thinking and discussing AI systems in the abstract, to think quite concretely about the role that each of these elements plays in the context of a given AI system. And that's useful for two reasons. First of all, it helps understand what exactly are the technological changes as a firm moves from conventional ways of doing things, performing a business task, to adopting a given AI system. And secondly, it's crucial for an adequate understanding of relevant risks. The reason for that is that each of these three elements can be associated with specific challenges and risks. And therefore, in order to understand the risks that a specific given AI system poses, it is important to consider the role that each element plays in the context of that system. That's our introduction to AI. We then move on to the second part of the report, where we discuss the challenges and guiding principles for responsible AI adoption. As already mentioned, the discussion in this report isn't unique to financial services, but it provides the foundation for understanding AI-related risks in financial services markets. We begin this discussion by identifying four important background considerations. These background considerations are often at the root of a variety of more specific concerns that may arise in relation to AI systems. I'll quickly go through each of them. The first concern or background consideration is data quality. AI systems are data-driven systems, and as a result, their performance crucially depends on the quality of the data involved in their development and operation. And for a number of reasons, understanding and managing data quality can be particularly challenging in the context of AI systems. The second consideration concerns the characteristics of models. When machine learning is used to develop models, these models can have characteristics that set them apart from more traditional types of models. And these characteristics, in turn, can give rise to a number of challenges. Three characteristics are worth highlighting in particular. Firstly, models may be opaque, that is to say, difficult to understand. Secondly, models may be non-intuitive. In other words, the relationships between variables that they pick on may be unexpected and counterintuitive. And thirdly, models may be adaptive. That is to say, they may change over time. The third background consideration concerns the structure of technology supply chains and the fact that in the context of AI adoption, we can often see increases in the complexity of technology supply chains or increases in the reliance on third-party suppliers, for example. And once again, that can change challenges that arise when it comes to responsible adoption of technology. And fourth and finally, there is the scale of impacts associated with AI systems and the fact that when compared to conventional ways of performing business tasks, AI systems can often be accompanied by an increased scale of impacts, including an increased scale of potential harms. Those are the background considerations. And against that background, we then move on to consider a range of more specific concerns that may arise in the context of the use of AI. And we group these concerns into 6 categories. I won't go into detail on each of them. I'll just briefly mention them. The first category or area of concern is system performance. So here, the question is, do systems perform sufficiently well? And importantly, do they perform sufficiently reliably over time? Secondly, there is the area of concern for system compliance, which revolves around the question of whether AI systems comply with legal and regulatory requirements. Third, there may be concerns about competent use and human oversight. Fourth, where AI systems are used to make decisions, there may be concerns about the ability to explain those decisions to the individuals affected by them. Fifth, there may be concerns about responsiveness, which is to say, in cases where AI systems are used in customer-facing contexts, firms may face difficulties in responding to customer requests, for example, requests to rectify erroneous decisions. And sixth and finally, there is a whole range of potential concerns about different forms of social and economic impacts that AI systems may have. Now, over the last few years, there's been a rapidly growing recognition of these kinds of challenges and concerns. And in response, there's been a growing literature on AI ethics principles, which I'm sure a lot of you in the audience are familiar with. And in the final section of this chapter, we provide a brief summary and survey of this literature on AI ethics principles. We highlight the role of 5 key principles in particular, namely fairness, sustainability, safety, accountability, and transparency. And we also set out why transparency, in particular, can be considered a particularly foundational principle when it comes to enabling and ensuring responsible AI innovation. And that's the reason why then later on in the report, we dedicate the final chapter to an in-depth discussion around AI transparency. Before we do that though, before we move to the transparency chapter, the third part of the report considers the concrete potential impacts that different uses of AI can have in financial services markets. We do this by adopting a very broad perspective. We consider the full range of different use cases of AI across different areas of financial services, including banking, insurance, and asset management. And we focus on outcomes on consumers and outcomes on markets, especially those kinds of outcomes that may be considered particularly relevant from a regulatory perspective. We frame the discussion around 5 areas of impact. The first of those is consumer protection. Then we consider financial crime, competition, the stability of firms and markets, and finally, cybersecurity. And as we discussed in quite a bit of detail, in each of those areas, there are several examples for ways in which different uses of AI may enable significant benefits, but also several examples for how the use of AI may contribute to significant harms, namely in cases where the kinds of challenges discussed in part 2 of the report aren't addressed effectively during the development and deployment of AI systems. Now, having considered the different impacts of AI systems in financial markets, we then move on to the final part of the report, which, as I mentioned, provides an in-depth discussion of AI transparency. Now, as already mentioned, when considering the full range of AI ethics principles, the principle of AI transparency can be considered to play a particularly foundational role. And the reason for that can be summarized as follows. So given that there are these challenges for the responsible adoption of AI just outlined, and the concrete potential harmful impacts of AI in financial services, firms that consider the use of AI are faced with a need to ensure that AI systems are trustworthy and used responsibly. In addition, they also have a need to demonstrate that AI systems are trustworthy and used responsibly. So to demonstrate that, for example, to corporate boards or to other stakeholders such as regulators or customers. So there is this twofold need to ensure and demonstrate trustworthiness and responsible use. And what these two needs have in common is that both of them depend on the availability of information about AI systems, or more precisely, the availability of information about AI systems to different types of stakeholders. And that's precisely how we can define AI transparency, namely as stakeholders having access to different forms of information about AI systems. Now, that's a very general definition of AI transparency, of course, that immediately gives rise to a number of follow-on questions. And in the report, we focus on 3 of those follow-on questions and discuss those in a fair amount of detail. And these questions are, firstly, to whom should information be accessible? What are the different stakeholders that may have an interest in information about an AI system? Secondly, what are the kinds of information that may be considered relevant? And thirdly, why should information be made accessible? What are the different reasons why stakeholders may be interested in information? There's quite a lot of detail in the discussion of these questions in the chapter. Once again, I will just give a very brief summary of the high-level takeaways for each of those questions. So starting with the first question, to whom should information be accessible? Here, we draw a general distinction between 2 types of stakeholders, namely internal stakeholders on the one hand, and external stakeholders on the other hand. Internal stakeholders are stakeholders, individuals that are located within the firm that is using a given AI system. The most obvious examples within this category would be individuals involved in the development of an AI system, for example, or individuals involved in the use of an AI system during its operation. But other roles are also relevant. So, for example, members of risk and compliance teams, members of senior management teams, or members of corporate boards, for that matter, may also be considered to form part of this category. On the other hand, then there's the category of external stakeholders, which includes different roles that are located outside of the firm that's using the AI system. The most obvious examples here would be regulators and customers, but we may also consider shareholders, for example, to fall within that category, and members of the general public, for that matter. So those are the two main categories of stakeholders. As I've already alluded to, there's a lot of diversity within each category, so we shouldn't assume that different members of each category have the same needs. But the high-level takeaway of our discussion is that both categories matter and are important. In other words, a holistic approach to AI transparency should consider both the information needs of different internal stakeholders as well as the information needs of external stakeholders. Well, this leads me to the second question, which is, what are the types of information that may be considered relevant and of interest to stakeholders? And here, once again, we draw a distinction between two categories, this time between system logic information on the one hand and process information on the other hand. System logic information, colloquially put, is information that relates to how a system works. So examples for this would be information about the variables that a system relies on, and also importantly, information about the relationship between input variables and output variables. In other words, the kind of information that's at the center of the technical literature on AI explainability and interpretability, for those of you who are familiar with that literature. On the other hand, there's process information, which we define as a broad range of different aspects of information related to the different phases in a system's design, development, and deployment. There are lots of different examples of information in the category, but just to illustrate what we have in mind here, examples include information about data provenance, for instance, information about system performance tests, system monitoring, or the training of system users, for example. So those are the two broad categories of information. And once again, the high-level takeaway, the high-level message is that both types of information are important. So different stakeholders, both internal and external stakeholders, can be interested in system logic information or process information. And indeed, in many cases, they will be interested in both types of information. Now that leads me to the third question, which is, what are the different reasons or possible reasons for stakeholders to be interested in information? And here, our discussion links back to the different areas of concern that I mentioned earlier, that we set out in chapter 2 of the report. And we go into a fair amount of detail to show that in each area of concern, in order to address concerns and also to demonstrate that concerns have been addressed, both system logic information and process information play an essential role. And so as a result, internal and external stakeholders may have an interest in both types of information across these different areas of concern. So this, in a nutshell, is the way we approach the discussion of AI transparency and the conceptual framework that we have developed for thinking about transparency needs. To sum it up, there's essentially a fourfold typology of transparency. On the one hand, we can distinguish between internal and external transparency. On the other hand, we can distinguish between system transparency and process transparency. And across these four forms of transparency, all of them have an important role to play in ensuring and demonstrating that AI systems are trustworthy and used responsibly. Now we go into a lot more detail, both on this chapter and on the other chapters in the report, but I will leave it at that. This concludes my brief summary. I hope this has been helpful in giving you a rough idea of the content of our report, and we would count ourselves very fortunate if it has also helped to spur some interest for you to look at the report for yourself and look at those discussions in more detail. You will be able to find the report on the Alan Turing Institute's website under the link that we've included on the slide, and we hope that you will find the report to be an interesting read. And as Cosmina mentioned, we'd be very interested to hear any comments and feedback on the report at our email address, which is policy@turing.ac.uk.
Thank you very much, Florian, for that overview. That concludes our session. A special thanks to Ravi for joining us today and for all of you who listened to us over the last 35 minutes. I hope that you will read our report, and we look forward to receiving any feedback that you might have. Thank you, and bye for now.
Thank you, Cosmina, and thank you to you all for taking us through that. It's interesting, your recommendations sort of echo what the editor-in-chief of Nature said earlier in the day. Dr. Magdalena Skipper made a real case, exhorting the research community to build collaborations with stakeholders, including them. You could really see that coming through. So to the audience, thank you so much for listening. Do keep exploring those virtual expo booths and enjoy some networking during the break. You can also invite your friends and family to CogX. Most of it is free to all, and so you can include them that way. Our next session is starting at 1 p.m. and that's going to be with the UK's Minister for Digital Infrastructure. So you can come back then. Enjoy the break.